Hi, my name is Sara Kassir, and I'm the policy lead at a relatively new center at Caltech called the Lead Center for Science, Society, and Policy, or LCSSP. LCSSP was founded in 2023 to facilitate greater engagement between the science happening at Caltech and essential public policy conversations. One important part of our mission is to empower Caltech students and other members of the community with a better understanding of the interplay between scientific knowledge and research and government decision-making. So today I'm talking to John Marken, who just completed his postdoc in biology and biological engineering at Caltech. John has actually been involved in LCSSP's work for the last 2 years, pretty much since we got started. And when I met him after joining the center a few months ago, I immediately felt like he was a great example of a scientist whose perspective had been broadened by learning about the policy world. So before John moves on to his next chapter, I thought it would be great to have him share some of his reflections about stepping into the policy world, as well as any advice he has for other STEM students and folks at Caltech who might be interested. John, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, sure. So when I first came to Caltech, I actually came here to do a PhD and stuck around for a postdoc afterwards. But I was definitely kind of 100% in the kind of biotechnology, biosciences bent. I wasn't really thinking about policy whatsoever. I came into Caltech because I was really interested in using biotechnology to kind of shape and change the society that we live in to address challenges in human health and in sustainability. So I was specifically interested in engineered microbes, and at the time that I joined Caltech, 2017, there was a really big push in the scientific community for unlocking the potential for engineered microbes to harness the possibilities of enhancing human health by changing our gut microbiome, enhancing agriculture by changing the microbes that live in the soil, doing bioremediation to get rid of toxins and pollutants in the soil, things like that.
All right, great. So I think it's fair to say you've always been pretty heavy on the STEM side. And one thing that you and I talked about, we're sort of like mirror images of each other in the sense that you're a scientist who became interested in policy, and I'm a person with a policy background who's interested in science and technology. And so while we're both kind of interested in this idea of using evidence to develop innovative solutions to complex problems, obviously the modes of thought we rely on and our analytical tools are different. And I know another thing that you and I have touched on is how easy it is to sort of underestimate the extent to which working in a particular discipline for a very long time can influence the way you sort of see the world and how you frame different kinds of problems. So how much exposure did you have to public policy analysis before kind of coming into contact with LCSSP? I know you said it was very little, is that right?
Yeah, very little. I mean, for my undergrad, I went to a liberal arts school, and there was a fairly strong public policy program there. And so I had peers who were interested in that sort of thing, but I never encountered anything like that in a formal sense through any of my education. Yeah.
Okay. So given that lack of formal exposure, what would you say was your opinion of policy work and its significance for somebody with your background?
Yeah, for sure. So I think, trained as a scientist and biotechnologist, like you see examples of really, really famous scientists who get involved in policy, like at the level of, oh, you win the Nobel Prize, now you're on some White House committee that advises the executive branch or things like that. But outside of things at that really, really, really high level, there really was no kind of sense of what it looks like for a normal working scientist to interact with public policy. So in my mind, that basically gets kind of filled in with things like public engagement or like community relations or things like that as things that I can actually have examples that I've seen in my life. But in terms of interacting with policy, there was basically no example that I could go off other than those really famous one-off examples.
Right, and obviously not everyone.
Right, it's not accessible for most scientists.
Winning the Nobel Prize to participate. Yeah. And do you think most people at Caltech, in your experience, have a similar sort of separation from the policy world? Yeah,
I think so. Certainly amongst the students who come in here, I think most people coming in are, like myself, people who've been kind of on a fairly narrow STEM-focused track that doesn't really provide any lived examples of what it looks like to engage meaningfully with policy as a scientist.
That's fair. So Biotech is obviously why you came to Caltech, and it was also the lens through which you kind of approached all this policy work. And if I understand correctly, shortly after LCSSP was founded back in 2023, our directors were thinking about what kinds of issues would be exciting for the Caltech community to dig into. And you actually met with them and said, hey, I've obviously been working on biotech for a while. I understand it is something that is regulated, but I really have no exposure to what that means or what it looks like. And, kudos to you for bringing that up and kind of admitting that gap in your knowledge. Was there anything in particular that sort of made you realize that you were missing this piece of the equation?
Yeah, I think it was just sort of kind of a gradual realization as I was working in this field of kind of taking engineered microbes and building them up for applications that would eventually go into the wider environment, like say an agricultural field or the human gut. I just kept thinking more and more in small scales of like, what would it actually look like to do this? Mm-hmm. And I eventually kind of stumbled upon this question of like, wait, is this even legal? Like, I don't even know.
Right.
And then I start looking and I'm like, why is nobody talking about this? Like, it feels like that should be maybe that's kind of the most important question before like, can we do it and can we do it effectively? Like, should we do this? Or like, if we were gonna do this, how would we actually go about? Mm-hmm. And I think like with an emerging technology, like engineered microbes, it's particularly challenging because if you're, for example, doing things like, oh, I want to develop new clinical therapeutics, well, there's an infrastructure for that, right? We have the clinical trial system it goes through, or if you're like, oh, even let's say make a new type of crop through a crop breeding program. Well, we have ways to go through USDA, FDA, things like that. Engineered microbes are in this kind of weird space where the kinds of applications they can address are types of applications that we haven't really seen before. Mm-hmm. And so that really amplifies the importance of the question and made me realize that actually I feel totally ungrounded in terms of like what it would actually mean to take these technologies out of the lab and into the real world. And that got me thinking like, maybe it's not just me who feels this way. Maybe there's a real need to kind of provide some more clarity about these things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's very insightful of you because, like we discussed, it's easy to sort of be locked into the thinking that's conventional in your discipline. But in a way, I guess you sort of brought up this topic and opened up a proverbial can of worms by bringing it to LCSSP's attention. And something that was sort of a passing interest for you ended up being a large part of your time and energy over the last couple of years. And you played a huge role in organizing one of LCSSP's first major events, which was actually a conference on the regulation of engineered microbes for environmental release. And the conference brought together regulators, industry, scientists, and others in academia to sort of talk about what is the current state for regulation, especially in these kind of amorphous contexts where they don't fit neatly into the paradigms that have already been established for other types of biotech. And I guess I'm sure that experience you learned a lot, right? Both not only in terms of pulling together diverse perspectives to talk about something as nuanced as biotech, but also just from a content perspective and the amount that you had to cover from being able to structure an event that dealt with regulation. I'm wondering how your mindset changed over the course of that process. So Caltech is not somewhere that typically has conferences on regulation. So when this concept was first brought up, it was a pretty unusual prospect. So in your mind, what was the purpose early on, and what were you hoping to get out of it? And did that change at all as the planning sort of unfolded?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when we were first conceptualizing the workshop, for me personally, I just wanted to have some sort of clarity about what's the situation here with regulations, like the kinds of stuff that the biotechnology community is working on, where does it fit in? Because I didn't know, and there wasn't anything out there that I could look at and read to find out what that would be. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it was that was priority number one, just provide a little bit of clarity to the scientific community. And then priority number two as a secondary priority was like, well, whatever the situation is that something that we kind of as a society are comfortable with? Like maybe it's actually not in an ideal place and we want to make some changes to either the science or to the regulation about how to get it there into a more ideal place. So that was kind of the secondary priority. But as we kind of built the workshop more and started talking to the people who were coming and had these discussions, we kind of realized that actually there were some pretty concrete things we could say on that latter point of how do we get things more aligned between the scientific community and the regulatory community, to the point where we at Caltech felt like we could actually say something concrete and meaningful that might actually have some impact. So that was really exciting to see that evolution of going from I'm just curious about what the state of things are to, oh, actually, maybe there's something I can do here.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I'm sure that must have been sort of gratifying to realize that you had a contribution to make. In addition to this being the first time you ever, planned a policy-related conference, I'm assuming it was also one of the first that you attended. And I know that subsequently you sort of became more involved in similar events, including the Spirit of Asilomar conference earlier this year. Can you tell me just how you would sort of compare the biotech and biology conferences you've been to that are more focused explicitly on the science to these policy sort of multidisciplinary conferences that you've been going to over the last year?
Yeah, I mean, it's a totally different type of conversation that happens, right? So like at a scientific meeting, I mean, this is a generalization, but fundamentally, the goal of science is to discover the truth, and people have disagreements about what the nature of the truth is, but at the end of the day, they're all kind of driving towards that same goal. In an engineering or technology-based conference, people make a product because they want to accomplish some stated task. And so the question is, how good is the thing you made at accomplishing that task? At the end of the day, the goals are very clear in these discussions. At a more policy-based conference, sometimes the goals aren't even clear to begin with, right? Because the types of things that are trying to be accomplished at the level of shaping societies, I mean, people have different opinions and they're both valid about what these policy interventions are even trying to accomplish. Like maybe you're trying to promote some sort of economic growth, maybe you're trying to promote some kind of moral value system, maybe they're aligned, maybe they're in conflict. That doesn't mean one's valid and the other's not. So it's like coming from a place where even at the very fundamental level, there can be disagreements about how to proceed and why to proceed was really eye-opening, because that's not really something you see at the level of kind of a science or technology conference. And so that really kind of brought to the fore the complexities involved in policy work of like, not only are the goals sometimes unclear or people have disagreements about the goals, but the kinds of forces that are in play are so complex and multifaceted that it's really just a totally different beast to kind of even think through. Yeah.
Yeah, different languages, different worlds in a lot of ways. Were there any specific conversations that you recall where that comparison was sort of crystallized for you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for me, one of the big examples happened at the Spirit of Asilomar meeting. Most of the people there were biotechnologists, but there were a few people from the social sciences who were also present. And for some reason, the conversation turned to golden rice. And so, I remember reading in my middle school science textbook about golden rice, and the narrative presented in the book was like, oh, golden rice is so good because it has this vitamin A that can cure these diseases that are affecting people in impoverished parts of the world, but a lot of people oppose it because it's a genetically modified crop. And so if only we had greater literacy about what GMOs are, maybe this life-saving technology would be more widely adopted. And I think that mindset that I was initially introduced to golden rice with is basically the exact same mindset that's been reinforced time and time and again through my training, to the point where, to me, that was just what it was. That's just what the situation is with golden rice. And talking to the social scientist about this at the conference for the first time really opened my eyes to the possibility that this narrative actually isn't right or even the only narrative. And I think one of the biggest, most enlightening things for me was I was talking to a social scientist and she said to me, well, why do we even need golden rice anyway? There's other ways to solve the vitamin A deficiency problem in these countries. And that was just really mind-blowing to me because no one had ever asked that question in any communities I was in or in any rooms I was in, to the point of like, yeah, wait a second, actually, who asked for golden rice to begin with? Who made this and why? And like, that really pushed me along a train of like, okay, let me actually start reading more about this, not from the technology angle, but from the social sciences angle. And that really kind of exposed a lot of assumptions that were grounded in my fundamental way of thinking that, like, one, it's always, always really eye-opening and enlightening to re-examine your own assumptions, but also the realization that, like, I had already gotten my PhD. I'm like 2 years out of my PhD from Caltech, and this is the very first time in my life that I'm even encountering the possibility that this narrative might not be the only way there is to think about it. And it just kind of really crystallized the value of talking to people who are coming at these questions from different angles, especially angles that are not exclusively scientific or technological, and realizing that a lot of very, very smart people have spent a very long time studying these questions from those angles, and I just had not been exposed in any capacity to the work they were doing, despite the fact that they're studying the very products that the biotechnology community, which I'm a part of, is making. And so that was a real moment where I realized, okay, we're not doing something right here. Like, that should not have happened.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure it was humbling, but at the same time, once again, kudos to you for reacting to it that way and realizing that there was another side of the story that was worth exploring. I think that's also just such a perfect example of the kind of dichotomy we were talking about, your own biases from particular discipline affecting your thinking. So, better late than never. At least you had that experience while you were still on campus, and I'm glad that you've been able to share it with us. I know one other thing that you and I talked about, which also relates to how a given discipline can sort of morph your thinking in ways that you're not necessarily fully cognizant of. There's always a sort of standard for what counts as an interesting question, right, in a given discipline. And I guess I'm wondering if there are any scientific questions that you now find more interesting, having been exposed to the policy world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the early goals of the workshop we organized with the Lind Center here was to try and uncover what those scientific questions might be, specifically from the point of view of safely and effectively potentially releasing engineered microbes into real-world environments. And I think it was really exciting to find that a lot of the regulators would say things like, well, we want to make sure we can do these risk analyses properly, but there are some scientific knowledge gaps that, if we knew more about these underlying fundamental scientific processes, about how microbes interact with their environment, for example, that would be able to resolve some of these unknowns and help with these risk analyses. And it turns out a lot of those scientific questions aren't necessarily questions that are widely recognized by the current scientific community as being really important. Obviously, there are always some people who are recognizing this and studying these things, but given the importance of these questions, I think it should be way, way more. And I think it's really interesting because you only see the value of these scientific questions when you look at it from the explicit angle of policy, regulation, actually impacting society. And so I think that's another angle where I think this type of work can really have an impact in illuminating to the scientific community the value of certain types of questions that maybe otherwise get overlooked, because if you're not thinking of it from that particular lens, it doesn't occur to you that this is actually a super critical question. But once you do, you realize, oh wow, we really need to study this. Why haven't we been pushing millions of dollars into studying this 10 years ago, And so, yeah, I think definitely that's an aspect to it.
That's really cool, just to hear how much your thinking has sort of evolved. Obviously, this was a very formative experience for you, kind of getting involved in policy work, even though, as you mentioned, it was towards the end of your career at Caltech. Any advice you'd give to either your younger self or other members of the Caltech community, students who might be tentatively interested in the policy world, but they're not 100% sure?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one advice I would give is that I think we're generally always trained to have respect conceptually for the social, political, policy implications of the work that we do. But I think one thing we're not really trained as much to do is to have curiosity for those implications. And I think that's what was really missing for me and that these experiences with the Lynn Center really unlocked is the realization that like, oh, like policy isn't just like a thing that's done, or that it's not a thing that like I can just leave to the other experts and they're going to handle it and I'm going to stay in the lab and do my own thing. It's a dynamic give and take where like we really need to have these conversations across these disciplinary boundaries in order to move forward and make sure everything's aligned in a way that is safe and ideal. And so I think like having more curiosity about like, what are these people actually doing? What are policy people doing? What do social scientists do? What are the questions they're interested in? How does that relate to what I'm interested in? I think like that sort of curiosity, I think cultivating that can really do a lot towards bridging those gaps across the disciplines and making a lot of good progress happen. Yeah.
I love that. So yeah, for posterity's sake, curiosity is important. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to sort of reflect on your experiences at Caltech and at LCSSP. We wish you all the best in your next chapter, and hopefully, you know, when you win a Nobel Prize someday, you'll be a part of that conversation with us from that angle.
Great, thank you.